I'm Juliana Forlano. You're watching act.tv. Tomorrow, senators will decide whether to move forward with the Ernit bill, purportedly about protecting children from sexual abuse. The bill actually endangers, everyone else by clamping down on social media platforms and undercutting encryption. Here to talk more about this is Washington activist Jon Pincus. Jon is a software engineer, strategist, and activist who focuses on justice, equity, or equality, diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. He is one of the leaders of Indivisible Plus Washington, which is a 20,000 plus person anti-racist, non-partisan, progressive statewide group. His current software product is the Nexus Today, an anti-oppressive news aggregator. Are you aggregating us, Jon? We want to be aggregated.
I often wind up aggregating you. It's based on what action is hot out there, and act.tv and your show in particular often show up there.
I am so happy to hear that. That is wonderful, and it's really nice to meet you. I'm glad circumstance has brought us together.
Indeed, I'm glad as well.
So let's talk about the Ernit Act, and let's be very simple for people who are just hearing about it right now. Sure. And why is it so dangerous?
Sure. I mean, it sounds like a good thing, right? But buried under this, what this act would do in the name of doing good things, it would create a 19-person government commission.
Wait, what is it supposed to do? Like, what is it?
What it's supposed to do is it's supposed to protect children from abuse online, which is a good thing. I mean, I think we all want to protect children from abuse online. But the way
nefarious things always start with "let's protect the children."
Exactly. And it's the way that it tries to do that. So it starts by creating potential liability for internet companies. So large companies like Facebook and Google, but then also anybody who's running an internet site would potentially be liable unless they adhere to the best practices that this new government committee comes up with. And who's on the government committee? Well, mostly law enforcement. Attorney General Barr leads it. They are not our friends. And so what they're going to be doing with this is to come up with some very, very restrictive practices that mean that companies can't be using encryption to keep messages secret. The government wants to spy on our messages. We use encryption. I mean, if you use Signal or WhatsApp or anything like that, these have very strong encryption that keeps other people from listening to them. Keeps the government from listening in, keeps hackers from listening in. Government's trying to get rid of that. So under the guise of protect the children, it's a very sneaky backdoor to get rid of the encryption that these various companies are doing.
How are the big tech companies taking this assault?
The big tech companies haven't really said a lot about this particular bill yet. The people who are leading the resistance to this are the civil liberties organizations, Fight for the Future, Electronic Frontier Foundation, sex workers who also particularly get targeted by things like this, LGBTQ organizations, the Hacking Hustling organization. Their active tech companies haven't said much about this yet. It's still fairly early in the process. As things go forward, we're hoping that the tech companies get involved.
Does this legislation actually help protect the children?
No, not at all. And again, it's good intention, but if you look at where the actual abuses to children,
I don't think it is good intention. Just hearing about it for the first time a few days ago, I don't know. Maybe I'm just paranoid.
All right. So those of us who are cynical, as you say, it's like anything that starts with protect the children, it must be, it must, there's probably something funny here. But I think a couple of years ago in 2018, there was a very similar bill that passed overwhelmingly, the FOSTA-SESTA bill, which was designed to stop human trafficking. Again, human trafficking, bad. We want to stop that. But it was the same kind of thing. It was really an internet censorship bill that all the people who are experts in human trafficking said have no effect. Will have no.
Clearly, it's worked fine. Human trafficking is over since they passed that bill about the
problem solved. And I think the same thing's going on here. That okay, the people behind the bill I don't think have good intentions. But what happens is a lot of Congress people who they're not experts in this. A lot of them are not internet experts. They don't necessarily have staff who really have the expertise. They hear about it and they say, "Oh well, sounds good. I mean, I want to vote for this." And often this legislation passes overwhelmingly with bipartisan support. So we got to do something.
Because if you don't vote for it, then you're like, oh, you're a pedo supporter or whatever.
Exactly.
Who is pushing this bill, and what purpose would it serve, say, the military state or the people who want to look into your phone? Like
it serves law enforcement. So the sponsors of this bill are Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, the Democratic senator from Connecticut.
Really?
Dianne Feinstein's also a co-sponsor. So it's got bipartisan support. And it's really law enforcement in particular who's pushing the bill. And then there's a bunch of anti-sex work activists who have actually helped draft the bill.
I'm concerned. I'm concerned about this.
You should be concerned.
Yes.
And when FOSTA SESTA passed in 2018, that's when Craigslist shut down. That's when Tumblr had to clamp down on all their blogs. Signal, the great encryption messaging platform, they've said if this bill passes, they won't be able to operate in the United States anymore. That's bad.
Tell me more about why that is.
Because this bill, the way it's worded, would outlaw the strong encryption that Signal uses. I mean, the reason I use Signal for anything even remotely confidential is, well, I don't want law enforcement spying in, but I also don't want hackers, cracking into my stuff. And so this strong encryption is important. The way Ernit is written, I mean, it doesn't actually say that in the legislation, but when you have this committee coming up with best practices, the best practices, companies won't be able to do them while keeping encryption. So Signals looked at this and they said, no, if that's it, peace out, we're out of here.
So leftist movements, and especially movements that bring together different races under the same common interests, have always been infiltrated by the government. Now, people who are protesting, and rightfully so, have their phone and they have the ability to talk back and forth. And basically the government wants in on knowing where's the next protest, what's happening, and what you're doing. That's what this comes down to.
Yeah, that's what it comes to. And the government has been, in various ways since the 1990s, they've really been trying to get rid of this strong encryption, to put government backdoors so that they can listen in. And once they can listen in, well, anybody else can use those backdoors too. So it's a long-standing government effort, and it's just their latest attempt.
How does this legislation consolidate power in the hands of people like Bill Barr?
Well, it appoints him in charge of this committee with a bunch of people that he can appoint to then come up with the best practices that companies have to do. If companies don't follow those best practices, then they lose their protection against liability from suits under the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So this is a whole separate issue that's also getting attacked. And what the government has realized is, well, they don't have to make strong encryption illegal. They just have to say any company that produces anything for it is, liable for huge amounts of money, and then companies will stop doing it. Same thing
Yeah, well, I think Bill Barr really cares about the kids. I mean, he showed just how much he cares about child sex abuse by how fervently he pursued the Jeffrey Epstein issue, right?
Yeah,
I mean, we just look at his background.
It's a big one.
How would this affect the financial industry? I mean, you pass information back and forth. It's encrypted.
It's a good question. They haven't said much about any of these bills. I think they probably feel that, well, they've got friendly enough relations with law enforcement that it largely wouldn't be applied against them. I mean, the PayPals of the world are, shall we say, very friendly with law enforcement, and so they're not as worried, although they certainly should be. As you say, it's like it's putting the same weakness there as for everybody else. And again, I really want to stress that I focus a lot on the law enforcement threat to protesters. When you have this weaker encryption, it puts everybody at risk from hackers and criminals as well. It's not just law enforcement who's the threat. And you're exactly right. That's why the financial industry should also be so concerned.
What would be the better way, say, to protect, children who are being abused and trafficked on the internet?
I mean, very honestly, there's plenty of strong laws that already are in place if you want to go the legal route. The better way to protect people would be to have things like, Medicare for all, universal basic income, situations where people aren't so desperate that they're resorting to these kinds of situations. That would make a huge difference. And then shifting so much of the work out of the police, out of law enforcement, to social services agencies that are, actually trying to help these children. There's plenty of great nonprofits that work here. There's people in government who work there. Give them the money and the power, not more power to law enforcement.
We are speaking with Jon Pincus, Indivisible Plus Washington activist. Jon, thank you. I just want to say we just got a raid from our Twitch channel. Thank you for the raid. Touring News, appreciate it. Hello, everyone who's just joining us. For those of you who are just joining us, we are talking about the Ernit Act, which is going through Congress in its nefarious forms to, under the guise of protecting children, when really it's about allowing police and encroachment more encroachment into our private lives. You said that these kind of laws should be scrutinized in the same way, say, FISA or the Patriot Act legislation would be scrutinized. Can you remind us about those laws and how the Ernit Act is similar?
Yeah, it's a great analogy. I mean, the Patriot Act got passed in 2001, right after 9/11, and it has a whole bunch of giving all kinds of power to law enforcement, including warrantless wiretapping. FISA in 2008 expanded it, and every few years these come up for renewal, and reformers try to get more protections in. These are the legislations that all the revelations that Edward Snowden revealed, all these abuses were done under the Patriot Act and FISA, and still are being done. I mean, the FBI routinely lies to get their applications. There's no good oversight. And threats of terrorists, that's almost as popular an issue as protecting the children, right? It's like we want to protect ourselves against terrorists too. And it's the same kind of thing where people who are not expert in these underlying issues tend to believe what superficially seems like the good legislation and support it.
Oh boy. Oh, well, how can members of our audience get involved in the grassroots efforts to discourage the passing of this kind of legislation?
It's a great question. There's, right now, today is a great day to be calling your senators. Today, because there's a vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee tomorrow. So there's a good Fight for the Future and several other groups have a page at no-earnitact.org. I just dropped it in the Facebook comments.
Great, thank you. No-earnitact.org.
And so that makes it very easy to call your senators. The group I work with, Indivisible, we do a lot of congressional advocacy. So most of the activists there have their senators on speed dial already. But if you don't, this is a great way to call in. And
today's the day to do it. I think the fact that it's a bipartisan bill, a lot of times we're like, call your senators. Well, I already know Chuck Schumer is voting for XYZ. So I feel a little bit,
these things are interesting, that there's a lot of Democrats who are on the fence or even actively bad who can be brought over. There's also Republicans. There's at least a handful of Republicans who are on the right on this. There's people I disagree with on virtually everything else, but man, they're good on civil liberties. Justin Amash in the House would be an example. Rand Paul in the Senate. I mean, I don't like much about either of these people, but man, they are good on bills like this. And so, yeah, no matter whether your senator's a Republican or a Democrat, give them a call.
So the no Ernit vote is what you need to say.
Yeah,
we have some good comments coming in from the stream chat on Twitch. A bondman says, my worry and concern is that these are the steps that would be needed for a country to end up in a system like that of China, where the government has ultimate access to your info and can decide your fate because of it. In response to that, Kwasi Pack says, yeah, we can't be too far off when every bill in Congress just gets named the Protect the Children from Terrorists American Freedom Act.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's a lot of people in law enforcement in the U.S. and there's some people in both parties who look at China and say, yeah, more of that here, please.
Yeah, another One of our folks, Lurk Ops, makes a good point. They are already doing this stuff illegally. They just want a hall pass for it now. Why not just continue to do it,
Well,
illegally as they are?
it's a good question, and I mean, I think to some extent with this current administration, they're going to do whatever they want. But I also think that there's a lot of people there. So I'd say two answers. First of all, this is why encryption is so important. Strong encryption is something that the government can't break into. Legally or illegally, they can't break in. You sometimes see this with iPhones, for example, where the government says, we can't get in. And so this is the strong encryption protects us even against illegal activity by the government. Mm. And then making these things illegal, there's some people that it won't deter, but there actually are safeguards in some law enforcement systems that work at least some of the time, and it makes it easier for, if these things do get used illegally, you can challenge them in court. And so there is protection by keeping these things to be illegal.
We are speaking with Jon Pincus of Indivisible Plus Washington. You can follow Jon at JDP2 on Twitter. Again, JDP2 on Twitter. Remember, Jon is a software engineer, strategist, and an activist. So we're happy to have someone who is knowledgeable in all these different areas talking about the Ernit bill. What else is going on in Washington with Indivisible? What else are you working on?
Oh, in Washington State, yeah, we're first of all, we've got a primary coming up in August 4th, so things are starting to crank up for that. We're doing a lot of work following up on, we've had, just like everywhere else, lots of marches, protests about in defense of Black lives with the Juneteenth work and all the out in the street. And so our members are doing a lot of stuff to support that as well. And then on the civil liberties front, there's a lot of work on facial recognition. That's another thread. Well, I mean, we don't have time to go into that, but it's another equally big thread. And again, it's getting pushed by law enforcement to be spying on us in all kinds of different ways. So pushing back against that's also a big deal.
How can we do that? Just in a brief. We do have a couple of minutes left, but how can we do that? What's the best way to go about taking action there?
Oh, so there's a really interesting approach to taking action. It's working on local ordinances that ban facial recognition or put a moratorium on the use by law enforcement. So Boston just passed one. There's dozens of cities around the country. And so there's more and more energy going around into passing these local things. That's been successful enough that Microsoft and Amazon have just announced that they're not going to be selling facial recognition to law enforcement for a while. And there's a new bill that's just been introduced by Senators Markey and Merkley, and then Representative Jayapal in the House, that would put a moratorium federally on the use of facial recognition. So getting involved in supporting that is a good thing as well. I mean, I really like the local activism, because that's a place where it's often easier for a small group of activists to have an impact locally. So combining the local activism with the federal activism is a really good thing.
Can you talk a little bit about the group Indivisible for people who may not know it and who may want to get involved?
Yeah, sure. Indivisible is a national group. It started in early 2007 in response to the Trump administration going up, and really designed to get progressives. It's an unabashedly progressive group to get progressives involved in congressional advocacy, elections, all kinds of political organizations. There's thousands.
It's the move on of the Trump years.
It's kind of trying to be, it's often paralleled to Move On, and it started up in much more of a social networky world than Move On did, and sort of re-envisioning that energy. There's local groups all over the country. There's statewide groups in every state, and so look around. Indivisible is easy to find. They've got on their main site, they've got a map of a page where you can find your local groups and get involved.
Absolutely. Jon, thanks for joining us today. Jon Pincus from Indivisible Plus Washington, an activist there. Follow him at JDP2. Thanks a lot, Jon. I appreciate you being with us.